What if I told you that scattered across 7 decades and 4 continents, 5 separate groups of witnesses described encounters so similar they might as well have been reading from the same script? What if these weren't random events, but carefully executed operations following a pattern we're only beginning to recognize? Tonight, we're not just retelling famous UFO stories, we're doing something that's never been done before. Analyzing these encounters as a connected whole, revealing the hidden behavioral patterns that suggest these weren't accidents or misunderstandings, but deliberate interactions following rules we don't yet comprehend. Most people know bits and pieces of these famous cases. You've probably heard about the Kentucky farmhouse siege, or maybe the Mississippi fishermen, or perhaps those Belgian police officers. But what almost nobody has done is laid them side by side and asked the critical question: what do these encounters, separated by time and distance, tell us when we examine them together? The answer is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because once you see the patterns, you can't unsee them. And those patterns suggest something far more organized and intentional than random visitations. We're going to spend the next half hour doing what investigators should have done decades ago, treating these cases not as isolated curiosities, but as data points in a larger phenomenon. We'll examine the behavioral signatures that repeat across cultures and eras, the investigation methods that actually worked versus those that failed, and most importantly, what the consistency of these accounts reveals about the nature of the phenomenon itself. By the end, you'll understand why these 5 cases, when analyzed together, represent some of the most compelling evidence we have that something real, structured, and profoundly non-human has been interacting with humanity for decades. So settle in, because we're about to connect dots that have been waiting 70 years to be connected.
Before we dive into individual cases, we need to establish what makes an encounter genuinely significant versus just another light in the sky. The difference matters enormously because we're not interested in ambiguous blobs or distant glows. We're interested in events where witnesses came face to face with structured craft and their occupants, where the proximity was close enough to observe details, and where the evidence left behind could be measured, photographed, or documented by trained professionals. This is the gold standard, and it's far rarer than most people realize. When researchers talk about close encounters of the third kind, they're referring to events where witnesses observe the occupants of unidentified craft. But even within this category, there's a hierarchy of credibility. The cases we're examining today sit at the very top of that hierarchy, because they share specific characteristics that make them nearly impossible to dismiss. They involve multiple independent witnesses who had no prior relationship or reason to coordinate stories. They occurred under conditions of excellent visibility, with clear weather and minimal atmospheric distortion. They were investigated by official authorities who took the reports seriously enough to document them in detail. And perhaps most importantly, they left behind physical traces that could be analyzed by scientists using the tools of their era. Let's establish the framework we'll be using throughout this analysis. When we examine these encounters, we're looking for what investigators call behavioral signatures. These are consistent patterns in how the phenomena behave, how they interact with witnesses, and how they respond to human presence. If these were random misidentifications of conventional objects, we'd expect wild variation in the details. Instead, what we find is striking consistency across different decades, different countries, and different types of witnesses. This consistency is itself a form of evidence, suggesting that whatever these witnesses encountered, it operated according to rules or protocols that remained stable over time.
The first pattern we need to understand is what I call the pattern of deliberate proximity. In each of our 5 cases, the craft and occupants didn't simply pass by at a distance, they positioned themselves in locations where human witnesses would inevitably observe them. At Kelly-Hopkinsville in 1955, the beings approached a rural farmhouse and remained for hours, pressing against windows and appearing on the roof despite repeated gunfire.
In Voronezh in 1989, a glowing sphere descended into a public park in broad daylight while children were playing football. In Pascagoula in 1973, the craft positioned itself directly over two men fishing on an isolated pier. In Cussac in 1967, small beings appeared in an open field where children were tending cattle, and at Ilkley, Moor in 1987, a lone being positioned itself on a hiking path where it would inevitably be seen. This isn't the behavior of visitors trying to avoid detection. This is the behavior of something deliberately making its presence known to specific individuals in specific circumstances. The locations matter too. These weren't random wilderness areas or desolate wastelands. They were places where humans were actively present and engaged in normal activities: farming, playing, fishing, tending animals, hiking. The craft and beings inserted themselves into human spaces, not the other way around. This suggests intentionality, a desire or need to interact with humans in their own environments, rather than luring them to isolated locations. The second pattern is what we might call methodical observation. In multiple cases, the beings appeared to be studying their environment or the witnesses themselves with systematic precision. At Voronezh, witnesses described a hovering probe that scanned the ground with mechanical movements, circling the larger beings as though performing measurements. The footprints left behind were several inches deep, suggesting something extremely heavy had stood there, and the probe's behavior indicated environmental analysis. At Pascagoula, Charles Hickson described being examined by what he called a mechanical eye, a floating spherical device that scanned his body with clinical detachment. At Cussac, the small beings were observed making quick, precise motions, bending over the ground and rising again as though examining something. At Ilkley, Moor, Philip Spencer watched a being that appeared to gesture before it ran up a steep slope with inhuman speed and entered a dome-shaped craft. These aren't the actions of tourists or casual observers. This is systematic behavior suggesting data collection, environmental sampling, or biological study. The beings moved with purpose, used apparent instruments or devices, and conducted their activities with the kind of methodical efficiency we'd expect from researchers or technicians. They weren't panicking or confused by human presence. They were completing tasks, following procedures, and only departing once their activities were finished. This level of organization suggests intelligence, planning, and specific objectives rather than random exploration. The third pattern, and perhaps the most unsettling, is what I call controlled paralysis and selective interaction. Multiple witnesses across different cases described being rendered unable to move when the beings focused attention on them. At Voronezh, a boy was struck by a beam of light and frozen in place, unable to move until the beam ceased. At Pascagoula, both Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker experienced total paralysis, where their muscles simply refused to obey commands, despite their conscious desire to flee. At Ilkley, Moor, Philip Spencer's camera malfunctioned and his compass went haywire, suggesting some form of electromagnetic interference. Even at Kelly-Hopkinsville, while the witnesses weren't paralyzed, they described a sense of overwhelming fear and the family dog refusing to come out from under the porch even after the beings departed. This ability to affect human physiology and nearby equipment isn't random. It appears to be deployed selectively when witnesses attempt to approach, flee, or otherwise interfere with whatever activities the beings are conducting. It's not universal or constant, it's targeted and purposeful. This suggests an advanced understanding of human neurology and the ability to manipulate it at will. More disturbingly, it suggests the beings can choose whether to allow witnesses to retain mobility or to render them helpless. The decision appears to be tactical rather than aggressive, used to control situations rather than harm witnesses. No one was permanently injured by these paralysis effects, but everyone affected was terrified by the loss of bodily autonomy. What emerges from these patterns is a picture of organized, purposeful activity by intelligences that understand human behavior, can predict human responses, and possess the capability to control interactions where necessary. These aren't random encounters with confused aliens who accidentally stumbled into human spaces. These are structured operations conducted by entities that know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And that realization changes everything about how we should interpret these events. Now that we've established the behavioral patterns, we need to examine something equally important: how human institutions responded to these encounters. Because here's where things get really interesting. The quality of official investigation varied wildly, and that variation itself reveals something profound about how unprepared our systems were, and still are, to deal with genuinely anomalous events. Some cases received serious professional attention, with resources deployed and evidence carefully collected. Others were dismissed almost immediately despite compelling witness testimony. Understanding why reveals as much about human institutional behavior as the encounters themselves reveal about non-human behavior. Let's start with what good investigation looks like. The Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter in 1955 provides an almost textbook example of how law enforcement should respond to extraordinary claims. When the Sutton and Taylor families burst into the Hopkinsville police station that night, the officers on duty could have easily dismissed them as pranksters or drunks. Instead, they noticed something that couldn't be faked: genuine terror. These were multiple adults and children, pale and trembling, some crying, all describing the same events with remarkable consistency. The police took them seriously enough to organize a massive response. 8 Hopkinsville officers, several sheriff's deputies, 4 Kentucky state troopers, and 2 military police officers from nearby Fort Campbell formed a caravan and drove to the farm. What they found wasn't a hoax. Shell casings were scattered across the porch and yard from dozens of rounds fired. Windows had been shattered from bullets fired outward. The screen on one window was torn open. Inside the home, furniture was barricaded and children's bedding was piled in a protective corner. The dog refused to come out from under the house even with the owners present. The officers stayed nearly 2 hours, interviewing family members separately and inspecting the scene. None of the adults appeared intoxicated. No alcohol was found. Every witness gave a consistent description of the beings and their movements. There was no sign of a prank, no indication the story had been rehearsed, and no physical evidence of a hoax. Only the undeniable proof that the family had fired dozens of rounds at something that frightened them profoundly. This is what professional investigation looks like. The officers didn't arrive with predetermined conclusions. They gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses separately to check for consistency, examined physical traces, and documented everything methodically. They took the witnesses seriously while maintaining professional skepticism. The result is one of the best documented close encounters in American history, not because the police believed in flying saucers, but because they did their jobs competently. The case entered Project Blue Book's files as unexplained, and even the most skeptical investigators acknowledged the witnesses were sincere and the police response was appropriate. Now, contrast that with how some other cases were handled. The Pascagoula incident initially faced skepticism despite the obvious trauma of the witnesses. When Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker walked into the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, they looked drained and shaken. But the sheriff's first instinct was to test them. He left them alone in a room with a hidden recorder, expecting to catch them laughing about fooling the deputies. What the tape captured instead became crucial evidence: 2 men in genuine psychological distress, with Hickson trying to calm Parker while admitting his own fear that the beings might return. That tape alone convinced the sheriff something extraordinary had occurred. But imagine if he hadn't thought to record them. The case might have been dismissed as a tall tale from 2 workers seeking attention. The Voronezh incident demonstrates yet another approach, and it's one that should be standard, but rarely is. When reports reached Soviet authorities about beings and a craft landing in a public park, they didn't suppress or mock the story. Instead, they dispatched scientists from the Voronezh Geophysical Laboratory, including specialists in atmospheric physics and soil chemistry. These investigators interviewed children separately, collected soil samples, measured radiation, mapped impressions, and examined geometric patterns around the site. The children, interviewed one by one, provided consistent descriptions of the being's height, the probe's behavior, and even the shape of the craft's hatch. Drawings made independently by the children showed remarkable alignment. This wasn't folklore or rumor. This was scientific documentation of an anomalous event.
What's fascinating about the Voronezh investigation is that Soviet scientists didn't pretend to have all the answers. They documented the physical traces, noted the radiation readings were consistently above background level in a measured circular pattern, observed that soil samples showed fused particles impossible to attribute to natural processes, and acknowledged the witness testimony was credible and consistent. Then they simply labeled the case unusual, unexplained, and requiring further study. No one claimed it was swamp gas or weather balloons. No one ridiculed the witnesses. The scientists admitted the evidence didn't fit conventional explanations and moved on. This intellectual honesty is rare and valuable. The Ilkley Moor case introduces another element, photographic evidence. When Philip Spencer, a former police officer, captured an image of a small being on the Yorkshire moors, he knew the photograph would face intense scrutiny. He took it to Kodak Laboratories, where technicians examined the film for signs of tampering. Their conclusion was careful and technical. The negative showed no evidence of double exposure, no edge distortion from overlay, no chemical anomalies from reworking, and no signs of cut and paste methods. Though Kodak could not certify the subject as extraterrestrial, they confirmed the image had not been faked. This is crucial because it eliminated the most obvious explanation for dismissing the case. But photographic evidence alone wasn't enough for investigators with the British UFO Research Association. They also examined Spencer's missing time, the 90 minutes he couldn't account for between leaving his farmhouse and arriving at his father-in-law's home. They arranged for hypnotic regression conducted by a medical professional under controlled guidelines. During hypnosis, Spencer described being taken aboard the craft, details he hadn't consciously remembered. The recollections were fragmented, but consistent with the missing time indicated by his watch. Importantly, the hypnosis transcripts showed Spencer didn't embellish his memories or drift into fantasy. His descriptions were simple, reluctant, and often incomplete, suggesting he was recalling fragments rather than inventing scenarios.
Then there was the compass malfunction. Spencer had been carrying a magnetic compass for navigation. Later that afternoon, the needle spun erratically, refusing to settle on north. The instrument remained faulty for days before returning to normal with no mechanical damage evident. Investigators examined it, but found no physical cause for the disruption. This detail matters because it provides an objective measurement of anomalous effects. Human perception can be fooled, but compasses don't malfunction without physical cause. The fact that Spencer's compass went haywire and stayed that way for days suggests exposure to something that affected magnetic fields. What we see across these investigations is a spectrum from excellent to inadequate. The best investigations treated witnesses with respect while maintaining standards of evidence. They collected physical samples, documented traces, interviewed witnesses separately, and preserved evidence for analysis. The worst investigations started with conclusions and worked backward, dismissing witnesses as confused or attention-seeking without seriously examining the evidence. This variation isn't just about individual competence, it reflects institutional capacity to deal with genuinely anomalous events. Most investigative procedures assume conventional explanations will eventually emerge. When they don't, many investigators simply force-fit conventional explanations anyway, rather than accept uncertainty. The cases that remain most credible decades later are precisely those that were investigated most professionally. Kelly-Hopkinsville endures because of the extensive police response and documentation. Voronezh remains compelling because Soviet scientists approached it methodically without predetermined conclusions. Pascagoula is taken seriously because the sheriff's tape captured genuine trauma. Ilkley Moor maintains credibility because the photograph was professionally authenticated and multiple forms of evidence corroborated Spencer's account. These cases set a standard for how anomalous events should be investigated, with professionalism, thoroughness, and intellectual honesty about what can and cannot be explained. Now we arrive at perhaps the most important aspect of these cases, the physical traces they left behind. Because here's the thing that separates genuine close encounters from misidentifications or hoaxes. Real events leave real evidence. Not just witness testimony, not just emotional trauma, but measurable, photographable, analyzable traces in the physical world. And these 5 cases produced exactly that kind of evidence in ways that remain difficult to explain conventionally even decades later. Let's examine what was actually found and what it tells us. At the Sutton farmhouse in Kelly-Hopkinsville, the physical evidence was straightforward but compelling. Dozens of spent shell casings scattered across the property proved extensive gunfire had occurred. The casings weren't planted props, they matched the weapons the family owned, and the burn patterns on the grass showed where shots had been fired. Shattered windows and torn screens documented that bullets had been fired outward from inside the house, consistent with the family's claim of defending themselves against beings approaching from outside. The indentations in a section of fence were photographed and measured. They were small, round, and didn't match any known animal claw or farming tool. The pattern suggested something had gripped the fence with enough force to leave marks. The most telling evidence at Kelly-Hopkinsville wasn't what investigators found, but what they didn't find. There were no footprints around the house that matched the beings described by witnesses. If the family had been shooting at raccoons, possums, or owls, there would have been dead animals or blood trails. None were found. If neighborhood pranksters had been harassing the family with masks and costumes, there would have been human footprints, disturbed vegetation showing paths of approach and retreat, perhaps dropped props or torn clothing. None of that existed. The physical evidence matched the family's account of shooting at small beings that floated rather than walked and seemed impervious to bullets. It contradicted every conventional explanation skeptics offered.
The Voronezh landing site provided even more concrete physical evidence because Soviet scientists collected samples and documented everything with scientific rigor. The impressions in the soil formed a triangular layout, suggesting something with 3 points of support had rested there. The depressions were several inches deep and required considerable weight to create. Soil samples showed abnormal mineral patterns with some particles fused together in ways that suggested exposure to intense heat or energy. This fusion wasn't the result of any farming equipment or natural process. Radiation specialists detected higher than normal levels around the impressions, though not high enough to be immediately dangerous. The readings were unusual for a public park and formed a circular pattern centered on the landing site. Broken tree branches near the site formed a symmetrical pattern as if something wide and circular had passed over them. Several leaves showed signs of heat exposure. The grass around the impressions was partially discolored, forming an irregular ring. Air analysis taken hours later showed no known chemical traces but indicated brief atmospheric disturbance. Most tellingly, the sulfur-like odor reported by witnesses at the Cussac encounter was also noted at Voronezh, lingering in the air after the craft departed. This smell is interesting because it's been reported in numerous close encounter cases worldwide, suggesting some common element in whatever propulsion or power system these craft use. At Pascagoula, the physical evidence was more subtle but still significant. Both Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker had small circular puncture marks on their arms where they claimed the being's claws had gripped them. Medical examination documented these marks. They were consistent with Hickson's description of the scanning process, but inconsistent with self-inflicted wounds or common injuries. The men also exhibited physiological symptoms: weakness, nausea, trembling, and disturbed sleep patterns that persisted for days. These aren't symptoms you can fake convincingly over extended periods. The sheriff's secret recording captured their genuine psychological distress when they thought no one was listening. That tape remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the entire case because it documents emotional state in a way that's nearly impossible to fabricate.
The Cussac encounter left traces that French government investigators from Japan, operating under the National Space Agency, documented systematically. The grass near the hedge showed discoloration in a circular shape. Soil examined in early tests had slightly elevated levels of nitrogen and other minerals, unusual for an untouched pasture. The sulfur smell was still faintly detectable when investigators arrived. Most intriguingly, a compass held over the discoloration circle deviated from magnetic north by several degrees. When placed outside the circle, it returned to normal. Though the effect was temporary, it was significant enough to be documented as evidence of some kind of electromagnetic disturbance. What's remarkable about the Cussac traces is their subtlety. Unlike Voronezh, where the craft apparently landed with considerable weight, the Cussac beings and their sphere left minimal physical evidence. This suggests different types of craft or different operational modes. The Voronezh landing appeared to be a deliberate, sustained presence with heavy equipment and multiple beings conducting extended operations. The Cussac event was briefer, lighter, more like a quick examination than an extended study. Yet both left measurable traces that investigators could document and analyze. The consistency of finding electromagnetic effects, soil changes, and unusual atmospheric signatures across different cases in different countries suggests these aren't coincidental, but rather characteristic effects of the phenomenon. The Ilkley Moor evidence combines photographic documentation with equipment malfunction and physiological effects. The photograph Spencer captured shows a small humanoid figure with proportions matching his description. Large head, elongated arms, greenish tint. Professional analysis ruled out obvious fakery. The compass malfunction lasted days, suggesting prolonged exposure to something that magnetized the instrument's mechanism. Spencer's missing time, 90 minutes he couldn't account for, was corroborated by his watch and confirmed by his father-in-law when he arrived. Under hypnosis, he described being taken aboard a craft and examined, recollections that emerged in fragments rather than as a rehearsed narrative. What all this physical evidence demonstrates is that these encounters weren't purely subjective experiences. They involved interactions with physical reality that left measurable traces. Soil composition changed, radiation levels elevated, magnetic fields disrupted. Witnesses sustained minor injuries, equipment malfunctioned. These effects are objective and verifiable, not dependent on whether you believe the witness testimony. A compass that spins erratically for days doesn't care whether you think UFOs are real. Fused soil particles don't form because someone imagined them. Radiation elevated above background levels doesn't happen because witnesses were confused. The skeptical explanations for these traces have never been satisfactory. Some suggest soil contamination from fertilizers or industrial runoff, but that doesn't explain the geometric patterns or the temporary nature of some effects. Others propose electromagnetic disturbances from electrical storms or power lines, but weather records show clear conditions during most of these encounters and power lines weren't present at the locations. Still others argue the physical traces could have been created by conventional means and falsely attributed to the encounters, but this requires assuming coordinated hoaxes involving multiple independent witnesses, professional investigators, and scientific laboratories, all maintaining consistency over decades. The simpler explanation, the one that actually fits the evidence, is that something physical occurred at these locations. Craft of some kind landed or hovered. Beings of some kind interacted with the environment and with witnesses. The interactions left characteristic traces: electromagnetic effects, soil changes, radiation elevation, equipment malfunction, and physiological impacts on witnesses. These traces are exactly what we'd expect if advanced technology was operating in those spaces, technology that affected its immediate environment in measurable ways. The evidence isn't perfect or complete, but it's far more substantial than most people realize. And when you examine it across multiple cases, the consistency becomes striking and difficult to dismiss.
We've examined behavioral patterns, investigation quality, and physical evidence. Now we need to address the element that ultimately determines whether these cases remain credible or fade into folklore: the witnesses themselves. Because at the end of the day, we're relying on human testimony about extraordinary events, and human testimony is notoriously unreliable under the best circumstances. So what makes these particular witnesses credible decades after their encounters? And what does that credibility tell us about the phenomenon? Let's establish what we mean by credible witnesses. We're looking for several key factors. First, consistency over time. Did the witness tell the same story immediately after the encounter, months later, years later, and decades later? Second, independence. Were there multiple witnesses who couldn't have coordinated their stories? Third, lack of motive. Did the witness have anything to gain from reporting the encounter, or did they face ridicule and harassment? Fourth, prior credibility. Were these people known in their communities as honest, sober, and reliable before the encounter? And fifth, resistance to embellishment. Did the witness stick to what they observed without adding dramatic details or evolving their story over time? The Sutton and Taylor families at Kelly-Hopkinsville pass all these tests. None of them sought publicity. In fact, they actively avoided it. When reporters showed up, the families refused interviews and resisted attention. They gained nothing from the encounter except scrutiny and ridicule from neighbors who thought they were crazy. Every witness gave consistent descriptions across separate interviews conducted by police. Not one person involved ever contradicted their earlier statements, not over days, not over weeks, not over decades. Glennie Langford, the matriarch of the Sutton family, was known in the community as level-headed and deeply religious. Lucky and J.C. Sutton were described by neighbors as practical, hard-working men who weren't prone to flights of fancy. The visiting Taylor family had no reason to participate in a hoax that would make them look foolish.
What makes the Kelly-Hopkinsville witnesses particularly credible is what they didn't do. They didn't write books, they didn't go on speaking tours, they didn't try to profit from their experience. When the media attention became overwhelming, they shut down and refused further cooperation. This is not the behavior of hoaxers or attention seekers. This is the behavior of people who experienced something terrifying and wanted to be left alone to process it. Their consistency and reluctance actually enhance their credibility rather than diminish it. At Voronezh, the witnesses were mostly children, which initially seems to undermine credibility since children have vivid imaginations. But here's what makes the Voronezh children credible. They were interviewed separately by scientists who knew how to detect coached responses. Each child drew pictures independently that showed remarkable alignment. They described the being's height, the probe's behavior, and the craft's appearance with precision that matched across all accounts. Children are notoriously bad at maintaining consistent lies, especially under separate questioning by adults trained to detect inconsistencies. Yet these children never wavered. Moreover, several adults also witnessed the event and corroborated the children's accounts. Teachers, parents, and local residents who had been near the park independently described the same details. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker at Pascagoula represent perhaps the gold standard for witness credibility. Hickson was 42 years old, a shipyard foreman with decades of work experience and a family to support. He had no history of UFO interest and no motive to fabricate a story that would make him look crazy. Parker was 19, shy, newly arrived in town, and terrified of ridicule. The idea that these two men would coordinate an elaborate hoax that required faking genuine psychological trauma, maintaining perfect consistency under police interrogation, passing polygraph tests, and never deviating from their story over decades strains credulity far more than accepting they experienced what they claimed.
The sheriff's tape of Hickson and Parker is the single most powerful piece of witness credibility evidence in UFO history. When the men thought they were alone and unrecorded, they didn't laugh about fooling anyone. They didn't discuss how to keep their story straight. Hickson quietly tried to calm Parker while admitting his own terror that the beings might return. Parker sobbed and said he felt he was going to die if he closed his eyes. This is not performance. This is genuine trauma, captured at its rawest moment. No actor could maintain that level of authentic emotional distress while simultaneously knowing they were perpetrating a hoax. The tape proves, as much as anything can, that these men believed absolutely in what they experienced. Philip Spencer at Ilkley Moor brings the credibility factor of professional training. As a former police officer, Spencer was trained in observation and evidence documentation. He knew how witness testimony would be scrutinized and what details matter. When he captured the photograph, he immediately took it to professional laboratories for analysis rather than releasing it to tabloids. He agreed to hypnotic regression under medical supervision. He allowed investigators to examine his equipment and interview him repeatedly. Throughout the process, he never embellished his account or added dramatic details. His descriptions remained fragmentary and uncertain where his memory was unclear, which actually enhances credibility. Fabricators tend to fill in all the blanks with exciting details. Honest witnesses admit what they don't remember or aren't sure about. What's particularly compelling about Spencer is what happened to his life after the encounter. He didn't become a UFO celebrity. He didn't write books or give paid lectures. He kept working in security and tried to maintain a normal life. The encounter affected him profoundly. He admitted to continued unease when fog settled over the moors, but he didn't exploit it for attention or money. This pattern of witnesses actively avoiding publicity rather than seeking it appears repeatedly in the most credible cases. It's the opposite of what we'd expect from hoaxers or attention seekers.
The Cussac children, Francois and Anne-Marie, demonstrated credibility through consistency and lack of embellishment. They were 13 and 9 years old when the encounter occurred, yet their descriptions remained stable across multiple interviews years apart. They never dramatized what they saw. They never added exciting new details in later retellings. When interviewed as adults decades later, they described the experience in the same measured way, emphasizing how strange and frightening it had been without trying to make it more dramatic than their actual memories. This restraint and consistency over decades, from childhood through adulthood, is remarkable and difficult to explain if the encounter was imagined or fabricated. What emerges from examining these witnesses is a profile that contradicts the stereotype of UFO witnesses as credulous, attention-seeking, or unstable. These were ordinary people, farmers, workers, children, police officers, living normal lives when something extraordinary interrupted their routines. They reported what happened, faced skepticism and ridicule, and then largely withdrew from public attention. None became wealthy or famous from their encounters. Most faced significant social costs for coming forward. Yet they maintained their accounts consistently across decades, through investigation, through skepticism, through media attention, and through the inevitable ridicule that followed. This consistency across independent witnesses in different countries and different eras is itself a form of evidence. If these encounters were hoaxes or misidentifications, we'd expect the stories to evolve and change over time. Memory is fallible and reconstructive. People unconsciously edit their recollections. But these witnesses didn't do that. They told the same stories in 1955 and in 2020. They described the same beings with the same features across interviews separated by decades. This stability of testimony, combined with physical evidence and professional investigation, creates a body of evidence that's difficult to dismiss without resorting to elaborate conspiracy theories involving coordinated lying across continents and generations. The final assessment of these 5 cases comes down to a simple question: what's more likely? That multiple groups of independent, credible witnesses across different decades and different countries all independently fabricated or misidentified encounters with remarkable consistency of detail, or that they experienced something real that our current understanding can't fully explain. The evidence, when examined comprehensively, suggests the latter. Something structured, intelligent, and non-human has been interacting with humanity for decades. These 5 encounters represent our clearest documentation of those interactions, and understanding them, really understanding them in their full context, changes how we think about our place in the cosmos and what might be sharing it with us.